Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine presented by all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. You can find out more about us at virginiainstitute.org. And I know it's in many cases already into Sunday, but happy Independence Day weekend. And I'll tell you, it has been a challenging one for sure. And that leads us to our first guest. Senior editor with Reason magazine, Jacob Sullum, is on with us. Great piece on George Floyd, the police, the Black Lives Matter, the rioting that we're seeing across the country, and best ways forward. Jacob, welcome to the program. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
Excellent. Happy Independence Day weekend to you.
Thank you. Likewise.
I know that Madison and company, when they were forming this nation, were trying to take into account that not everybody is perfect, and that there are going to be people who will act out of self-interest or anger or in any way, shape, or form make bad decisions. And they were trying to create a system that would try to limit the damage that could do. Have we so far removed ourselves from the principles of, I'll take care of me, you take care of you, and we wind up into a place where there are authoritarian positions that need to be kind of reimagined? And I'm not saying I'm an advocate of defunding or dismantling the police, but we are seeing a place where there are instances, I think it's fair to say, like in George Floyd's case, where it's unmistakably police brutality.
Yeah, I mean, you have to look at the incentives that are in place for police officers. I guess I should say most police officers are not going to be guilty of this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But there always will be some people who, as in this case, use excessive force. And we need a system that, first of all, discourages that, and then when it happens, holds people accountable. Mm-hmm. Holding people accountable is part of discouraging it in the end. And so there are a number of policies that would help achieve that goal. Some of them are very specific and directly relevant to this particular case. The most obvious one has to do with the use of restraint techniques that can impair breathing. Mm-hmm. And I've done some research on this, and I think that the most sensible proposal is to say that when police officers use neck restraints, which are potentially deadly, mm-hmm. not always, but sometimes, mm-hmm. That it has to be justified to use deadly force. Because this is a kind of deadly force in the same way that firing a gun is a kind of deadly force. When you shoot somebody or shoot at somebody, you don't necessarily kill them, but you might, and there's a good chance that you will. And the same thing goes for neck restraints. Mm-hmm. Even when they're not designed to obstruct breathing, when the idea is to obstruct blood flow and cause unconsciousness, if they're improperly applied, they can obstruct breathing and they can kill someone. So there are some proposals that say we should just not have neck restraints at all, just ban them completely, and some police departments have tried to do that. There's a proposal from the Democrats in Congress that would do that. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, there are narrower proposals that say specifically chokeholds, in other words, where you're deliberately trying to obstruct breathing. Those should be allowed only when deadly force is appropriate. And I think that the best solution really lies somewhere in between those two, is just to recognize that these kinds of restraints are potentially deadly. Therefore, unless you have reasonable grounds to believe that a detainee poses a threat of serious bodily injury or death to you or other people around you, you can't use this technique. Because, that recognizes the police do use deadly force, and mm-hmm. there are circumstances where it can be justified. But the problem is that neck restraints have not traditionally been treated that way. So mm-hmm. I think that change would make sense.
Well, let's. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was going to jump off.
And then another broader reform that's also been considered in Congress has to do with what happens after a death like this occurs. What are the consequences? Because the whole, the way the legal system responds to it, obviously it's too late to save George Floyd's life or anybody who's actually killed. But you want a legal system that sends the message that when this happens, people will be held accountable. And that goes to the question of qualified immunity, which is a doctrine developed by the Supreme Court that is not actually in the statute. It's not in the federal statute that allows lawsuits when police officers violate people's constitutional rights. But the Supreme Court has said that unless the right that was allegedly violated was clearly established at the time, you cannot sue under that statute.
Right.
And this is a problem because what it means to be clearly established frequently turns out that unless there was a case exactly like this one before, where a court ruled on, then you can't sue. Which means police end up not being held accountable for really outrageous conduct. Things like, these are allegations, but there's evidence to prove them. Just to give a few examples, a case you may have heard about in California where these Fresno police stole over $200,000 worth of in cash and in rare coins while serving a search warrant. Now you look at that and you say, that can't be legal and that can't be consistent with the Fourth Amendment. But the Ninth Circuit said it was wrong for them to do that. But because there wasn't a specific enough precedent, they were in a position to know that it was unconstitutional.
It's unbelievable.
Other cases involve things like there was a woman who agreed to let police into her house to arrest her former boyfriend, who actually turned out wasn't there at the time. And because she consented to let them in, they took this as permission to bombard her house with tear gas grenades, which wrecked the house and made it unlivable for months. And the question is, since she gave her consent for them to enter, was that also consent for them to destroy her house, right? Mm-hmm. And the appeals court said, well, if it wasn't clearly established at the time that this was a constitutional violation, so the police get a pass. And there are other cases involving, there's a case involving a kid who was shot because officers chased a suspect into their yard, saw a dog that was not at all threatening but deemed it a threat, tried to shoot the dog, ended up shooting the kid. I'll mention one other case.
It's so
one
many.
Other case involved what turned out to be an erroneous report of a domestic assault. Police came ostensibly to protect the alleged victim of this assault, and one of them, because he didn't like her attitude, ended up picking her up in a bear hug and throwing her to the ground, broke her collarbone, knocked her unconscious. And the court again said that àwọn officer deserved qualified immunity because nobody had ever done something quite like that before in that circuit in a case where that reached a judgment. So that sort of thing happens all the time. And so the Democrats have said, not just the Democrats, Justin Amash has put forth a standalone bill that he's an independent now, used to be a Republican. I'm sorry, he's a libertarian now, I should say. He was a Republican, then independent, now libertarian. And he has said we should make it clear that this is not part of the statute. Qualified immunity is not part of the statute, and it doesn't count as an excuse, and we should just scrap that. Democrats have a similar proposal as part of their big package of reforms, and the Republicans so far seem to think that this is just a non-starter. I mean, that's what the president's press secretary said in so many words. With a few exceptions, they are not prepared to go along with that reform, even though qualified immunity has been criticized by people across the ideological spectrum, including Justice Clarence Thomas, Don Willett, in the Fifth Circuit, have said this is ahistorical. It's not in the statute. It can't be derived from the common law at the time the statute was enacted, and it's just illegitimate. And of course, people on the left say this is outrageous to let police off for conduct that's clearly wrong, just because there's not a sufficiently specific precedent. So that's another broader reform that would help address this issue of what happens when police use excessive force.
Jacob Sullum is on with us from Reason Magazine, and the piece is a great column, 5 different just suggestions. And I need to push on the qualified immunity because I truly believe that our system is falling apart in this feeling amongst both Republicans, conservatives, whatever, and liberals, the Democrats, is that there's things going on behind the scenes that we don't see. The transparency of our government, the transparency of our judicial system, and I believe in all cases, including cases of police misconduct, you're innocent until proven guilty. The media has turned into this judge, jury, and executioner, and maybe it's because one of my earliest career stints was covering the Tawana Brawley case in Poughkeepsie that I've sort of gone down this run of saying, listen, just let us see everything publicly, let us see it all happen, and then we can make our own determinations as to what's going on here. And I don't have a problem at all with the idea of these qualified immunities. We've seen it for elected officials as well. Elected officials behaving completely unconstitutionally and then saying, well, you can't sue us because we're an elected official. These are the things that I think, and in essence, get down to why you're seeing so many people protest the government right now, is because they feel like the government has just got a hall pass to violate our rights. And maybe they didn't realize it when they were voting for these things over time, the citizens, but we've woken up into a place where we are no longer the sovereigns over the government.
Yes, and I think one way to look at these situations is that police officers, when they're accused of wrongdoing, absolutely deserve the presumption of innocence. The case should be proven. Some of these cases are much less clear than others. I just mentioned the Rayshard Brooks shooting in Atlanta, which involves facts that are much fuzzier than what happened with George Floyd. And the police officers who were charged almost immediately in that case, they have a good argument that they reasonably feared for their lives in that situation. So you do have to look at the specific facts, but I think a good rule of thumb is that there shouldn't be a double standard. In other words, police should not get more leeway to use deadly force than ordinary citizens do. And that also applies when you talk about the standards for the use of deadly force. That's another issue, and that can be addressed by courts or it can be changed by statute, as they did in California. Where they said basically that when a police officer uses deadly force, it has to be justified according to the same reasons that would justify you or I using deadly force, right? Absolutely. There has to be a reasonable fear based on the circumstances that the use of deadly force is necessary in order to prevent severe bodily injury or death. Now, as opposed to saying the previous standard in California was what would a reasonable officer do in this situation, which is fuzzier and broader. Yeah. So the idea is to apply the same standard so that conduct that would definitely send an ordinary citizen to jail, right? Theft or aggravated assault or a murder, right? That it results in the same consequences, even for people who wear uniforms and badges.
I would almost argue that they should face stiffer penalties because of their position of authority, but I'll go along with equilibrium in that as well, Jacob. You also mentioned in your column make it easier to get rid of bad police officers. And I want to add to that, if I can, and I know your piece talks about the unions, the strengths of some of these patrolman organizations that protect in the same way we see failing teachers. But also, I think we're not doing enough to train good cops coming in. Where our friends here at the Rutherford Institute in our flagship city, John Whitehead, has talked quite at length at how soldiers will return from the battlefield and go almost an accelerated course to the police academies because they already have, quote, training from their military service. But in their military service, you're looking at the people around you as possible enemy combatants, not as your bosses. And I think that there's got to be more social training in police academies to, especially in the case of former military, is those are no longer enemy combatants. They are your bosses and that kind of thing. Do you see any of that in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we need to look at training. In most states, you can become a police officer after going through training that is less extensive than what you need to become a cosmetologist.
Mm-hmm.
And I say this with some authority because my daughter went to cosmetology school, and it was, it's not like a 4-year college, but
right.
it's a pretty rigorous program, and the number of hours she had to put in, if I'm remembering correctly, was roughly twice what is typical in many places for police officers. Twice the number of hours. So there's probably should be more training, but then there's another issue which has to do with the culture of the police department. And as you mentioned, you certainly don't want to have police officers viewing themselves as soldiers. And it's not so much the equipment that they get.
Right.
There's been a lot of emphasis on surplus from the Pentagon that goes to police departments, which I think is problematic, but it really is symbolic of this cultural problem, which is you're not soldiers, and you shouldn't treat the people you deal with as if they're the enemy. And even if people go through enlightened, rigorous training, it's not clear what's going to happen afterward. In the George Floyd case, you had a situation where you had a couple of officers who had barely any experience. Mm-hmm. And they were clearly dominated by Derek Chauvin, who was the officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. And at least one of them repeatedly said, we shouldn't, hold him in a prone position like this. I didn't actually say he might suffocate, but that was the implication. We should turn him on his side. And Chauvin said no twice, right? So who are you going to listen to? The veteran police officer with all the experience who is supposed to know what he's doing, or are you going to llisten to what your training told you? So that's a serious problem. Even if people are properly trained, if they are then come under the influence of veteran police officers who say, forget all that stuff you learned in the academy, it's not really relevant on the street, then you get problems like this.
Oh, yeah, it's like training day all over again. And, again, you see instances like this where, elected officials, and I want to get into this in a moment, Jacob, but one last one on the idea of, helping law enforcement survive this assault on it. And I believe there's anarchy in some people's minds and dissolution of private property ownership as well. But that's a grander issue. But we were talking about the law enforcement and, what they're tasked to do and what they're asked to do. What politicians, and this perhaps is my most troubled part of this, is that the politicians demagogue these law enforcement officers after holding elected office, writing the laws that they're being asked to go out and enforce, and then campaign on "I'm tough on crime" or "I'm going to help the poor community" or whatever the rhetoric of whatever party. And the politicians are the ones who have written the rule book of saying go do these things to get these results, whether it be civil asset forfeitures or no-knock warrants. These are all laws written by, in most cases, members of a General Assembly or, at very least, on the local level, and then all the way up through Congress.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Politicians are responsible for creating these laws that the cops have to then go out and enforce. And we have to think about that. What are the situations where we want people with guns to go out and enforce these laws, right? So just to give you one example, there's been a lot of attention to uneven enforcement of the drug laws. Mm-hmm. And there are very clear racial disparities that don't necessarily result from racism. It's not necessarily racist motives. But the system that politicians have created requires cops, for example, to go out and arrest people for marijuana possession. And it turns out that black people are about nearly 4 times as likely nationwide to be arrested for marijuana possession as white people. And even though they are only slightly more likely to actually use marijuana, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a problem, an obvious problem in terms of equality under the law and the relationship between black communities and the police, and just having the sense that you are an equal mm-hmm. citizen. If you know that as a marijuana user, if you're black, you're 4 times as likely to get arrested for it as a white person who does exactly the same thing, you're going to kind of object to that, understandably so, right? So what do you do about that? Well, one solution, which I think Rush Limbaugh proposed years ago, is you arrest more white people. So you even it out. But the obvious solution from my perspective is you stop arresting people for marijuana possession. And if you do that, there will not be any disparities in those arrests because those arrests go away.
Well, and you arrest people for violating other people's rights, and I think that's one of the things societally we've wandered away from. I think it was Bernie Kerik in one of the very earliest Right on Crime events I went to said we need to stop making our jails places we put people who we don't like their behavior and reserve them only for people we're truly frightened of.
Right, and so you really have to think every time politicians pass a criminal law, every time they give police authority to arrest people, which, by the way, doesn't even necessarily require that they commit a crime, right? In Texas, for example, it's legal to arrest people for almost any traffic violation. Now, it doesn't usually happen. It rarely happens, but then you have the problem of figuring out if police are only doing this about 1% of the time, how do they decide, who gets handcuffed and hauled off to jail for a minor traffic violation? And obviously that creates a lot of room for discretion that may be improperly exercised. And yes, some of those police officers may be influenced by racial bias, either consciously or unconsciously, but there are lots of other variables that come into play. They may just not like your attitude. Now, you have a right to say whatever you want in this country, but it still might tick off a police officer enough that he will arrest you for something like not fastening your seatbelt or failing to signal a lane change. There are all kinds of, hundreds of different rules that you can break when you drive a car, and it's hard to drive a car for any length of time without violating them. So if the legislators say we're going to give police the authority to arrest people for these trivial violations, then that creates more opportunities for obviously more humiliation and more inconvenience and all of that, but it just it tends to escalate these situations, and you have more potential for violence. So that's a problem too. So every time politicians do that, they have to think, when we give police more authority to arrest people, what are the consequences going to be, and are they worth it? Is it worth the cost in terms of possible violence of an escalating situation in order to achieve whatever goal we're trying to achieve? And just one more example, and this is maybe a little more controversial, but the Rayshard Brooks case, which I mentioned in Atlanta, this is an arrest for DUI. He was a bit over the legal threshold. The current legal threshold was 0.08%. You may recall it used to be 0.1%. He was right at 0.1%. Yes, if you believe that's he's a danger to other people if he's behind the wheel and he's intoxicated, you obviously want to do something about that. But does it require routinely arresting people in that situation? This is in Georgia. This is a low-level misdemeanor, which theoretically you can get up to 10 days in jail for, but it is typically handled with other sanctions, like maybe your license is suspended, you pay a fine, you community service, right? So why are we routinely arresting people in that situation and hauling them off to jail when you could cite them, take precautions to make sure that they don't get behind the wheel again while they're still drunk, right? So maybe you boot their car or tow their car or take away their keys, and now you've avoided a situation that can kill people. I mean, that's what happened, right, in Atlanta. Had they not insisted on arresting him, he would still be alive. So you have to think about things like that happening when you have a policy that says, and which by the way Atlanta does have. So the police had no real discretion once they knew that he was intoxicated. They had no discretion to say we're going to cite you. That's the Atlanta Police Department policy. So we have to think about every situation where we have not just contact with the police, but potentially escalating situations that can lead to violence.
Last one for you. Jacob Sullum is on, senior editor with Reason, and there's a whole lot more in his column. Believe it or not, we're having a great chat, but there's way more in his column, and there are a lot more columns on this subject at Reason.com. But there has been in the periphery questions and verified in that the police officer in this case had been moonlighting at a nightclub, or I think it was a nightclub, where George Floyd actually worked as well, and they both worked security, bouncing. You know how nebulous some of these jobs are. Everyone gets a yellow jacket, and they stand outside doors and check IDs in many cases, or they're just there to make sure everything is okay. Should there be, and this is going to challenge you because Reason Magazine is one of the great libertarian thinkers out there, should there be, if you're a law enforcement officer, restrictions on places you can moonlight to avoid any issues that might, and I'm going to use this with the lowercase letter C, corrupt your decision-making process, along the line. So okay, you're fine being a carpenter, but we don't want you working security at nightclubs or concert venues. Or should that just be managed through the individual process, that if we find a police officer that's done wrong or gotten corrupted through working on the side, that we punish them at that moment and don't make it a blanket law?
I think broadly speaking, there might be some restrictions on what other jobs you can do. In this particular case, I have not seen any evidence that there was actually any personal animosity between.
Well, no. I haven't either. I'm just saying they did work together.
But one thing that came out is that other employees at that club said that Chauvin was a bit of a hothead, and that he had pepper sprayed customers, which businesses generally frown on that.
not good for business, really.
Not a good way to get repeat business. And so he had been told, stop doing that. But that's an indicator right there that there might be a problem with somebody who is overly aggressive. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate everything you've done.
Illustrated by what happened with George Floyd. And you mentioned the issue with getting rid of bad cops, and it's very difficult because the contracts that police unions arrange typically require an elaborate process, often involving arbitration by supposedly neutral third parties that 2/3 of the time side with the officer. And even in a situation, I'll just give you one more example. Breonna Taylor raid last March, where she was killed during a middle-of-the-night no-knock drug raid. And the officer who they are now trying to fire is, aside from all the other issues with the raid, why they were there in the first place, whether they had probable cause for the search, whether there was any reason to believe she was involved in drug dealing, which she was not. There is the issue of the tactics they used when they entered the apartment, and her boyfriend was awake in the middle of the night, thought that criminals were breaking into his house, and honestly, criminals were breaking into his house. They just happened to be cops. And he grabbed a gun, and he defended himself. Like, he fired one shot. The police responded, but with a hail of bullets, more than 20 rounds, just blindly fired, and that's how Breonna Taylor was killed. So the officer who, the one they're trying to fire, allegedly blindly fired 10 rounds into the apartment. And the rounds not only went into her apartment, but went into a neighbor's apartment, where it could have killed other people as well. So this is obviously reckless, reprehensible behavior, criminal behavior in my view, but certainly enough to get you fired, you'd think. And they are trying to do that, but it is not at all clear that they will succeed because they have to go through a process. So they sent him a letter saying, we plan to terminate you, and here's why. You were reckless, and it's appalling, and this is not the kind of behavior we expect from our officers, but there is an appeal process, and this can drag on, and even if they do get rid of him, he might come back. So that's a serious problem. And then when police departments do get rid of bad cops, other police departments frequently will hire them. And they may be unaware of their history because there is no systematic way of checking on it. They may not have the resources to do the background check. The other police department might have agreed that, well, the cop will resign officially, and we won't tell anybody about what happened just to get rid of him, right? So their incentive is, we want to get rid of this guy. We don't want him on our force. And they may be thinking less about what if he goes to work for another police department.
Yeah, they're just trying to get him off their roster.
Even when officers lose a certification to work in law enforcement, which theoretically should prevent them from ever being a cop again, the departments in other states may not know about that because there's no systematic way of finding out who has lost their certification. So these are problems that I think would help. If you could address these problems, it would help prevent the use of excessive force, get rid of cops who really should not be doing that work to begin with.
I know that the federal government has talked about financial incentives. I blanch at the idea. I see what happens when the federal government circumvents its constitutional prohibitions and funds public schools, and I worry that more Department of Justice money running local police departments is just going to wind up making this worse, Jacob. But you've talked about some of the things that have been mentioned by both Republicans and Democrats as fixes in Washington. How much of it can be fixed in Washington in your mind, and how much of it needs to be fixed more locally?
I think it's mainly a state and local issue. The federal government, Justice Department, does have a role to play if people's rights are being systematically violated. They have a role to play. I mean, under the 14th Amendment, they have a role to play. So we don't want to overlook that. And you have cases where there have been federal investigations of shootings or other violations of people's rights, which I think is appropriate. So the federal government does have a role to play, but when it comes down to things like what is your use of force policy, how do you train officers, how do you deal with officers who are falling below your standards, that sort of thing, that is going to have to be handled from city to city and state to state. And I think, look, the federal government already gives all this money to law enforcement agencies. You can argue about whether they should be. So most of the fixes that they're talking about when it involves changing what local law enforcement agencies do have to do with attaching more conditions to that money. Yeah. So if you want this money, you need to supply us with these data about use of force and police shootings and that sort of thing. I don't really object to that. I mean, I'm not sure they should be getting the money to begin with, but if they're going to give the money, they already attach certain conditions to it. These are some more conditions to attach. Whether that will accomplish much, I'm not sure. It would be nice if we could have more data, and there's not, there's a lack of participation that prevents us from getting a clearer picture of what's going on. So if this helps get a better handle on the situation, that might be worth doing. But I think the main solutions are going to have to come at the state and local level.
I said this with some controversy, Jacob, and I promise this is the final payoff pitch. That I would take the stand that said, listen, if you want to disband the politically appointed police chief model in favor of the constitutionally elected sheriffs, have the same police department, not saying reduce force or anything like that, but turn it back over to a sheriff's department where we choose who the leader is, not through a daisy chain of politicians who will eventually appoint a political position as police chief. I think that you could have some discussion about that, but we've found that even sheriffs aren't perfect.
No, and I would worry about, look, it's not great either way, honestly, but I would worry about the incentives that elected sheriffs or elected police chiefs, if they ever did that, would face, because there is, depending upon the local politics, portraying yourself as being tough on crime, which may involve going after lots of people who don't deserve it, people who are not actually violating anybody's rights, that can be popular. That can get you elected and reelected. Yeah, so they can be making bad decisions, but that nevertheless appeal to voters. So I'm not sure that would be an improvement.
It was just a curiosity. It's been something as the discussion of dismantling police departments have come up. I've said, we do have great sheriffs around Virginia that I think, a lot of people would hold in great high esteem for their belief in the Constitution. But like you said, that's still a moving target, and populism does rear its ugly head. Senior editor with Reason Magazine, Jacob Sullum, please give yourself some time. There's a lot of stuff both on this topic and others at Reason.com. Thank you so much for spending so much of your time with us this Independence Day weekend, and we really appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Coming up next, Damon Dunn. He is with the Pacific Research Institute. He's got a new book titled Punting Poverty, Breaking the Chains of Welfare. This Independence Day weekend, you sensing a theme here? We try sometimes here at Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Next.